Let's start with some numbers today. At the height of his career, Pablo Picasso employed between 12 and 18 studio assistants, people who stretched canvases, they mixed paints, they transferred sketches to larger formats, they catalogued works, they managed correspondence, and they even prepared materials. The machine of Picasso's production was considerable. Pablo Picasso is one of the most mythologized lone geniuses in the history of Western art. The story we have been told is of a single volcanic talent working in solitude, producing masterwork after masterwork from this interior fire. That story is not exactly false, but it is profoundly incomplete. And the parts that are left out, the assistants, the patrons, the critics, the dealers, the women whose emotional labor subsidize his creative output, those parts tell us something important about how we construct the idea of genius and who that construction serves. My name is Marilyn Mushakwe. I am a curator, a researcher, and an art advisor based in Zimbabwe. I have been in love with art for as long as I can remember, and I have spent years working with art, thinking about it, writing about it, advising buyers and collectors, and sitting with it in galleries and in homes. And the one thing I keep coming back to is this: art should not feel like it belongs to someone else. Welcome to A Twist of Thought, where we have conversations about art, what it means, who it is for, where it is coming from, and why it matters to all of us. The romantic idea of the artist as solitary genius is, like so many of the ideas we take for granted about art, a relatively recent invention. It solidified in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Romantic period, when artists began to reimagine or to be reimagined as special beings, closer to prophets than to tradespeople, suffering and misunderstood, ahead of their time. Before that, artists were understood as skilled craftspeople, which, as we discussed in another essay, was not considered a lesser identity. Michelangelo ran a workshop with numerous assistants and apprentices. Many of the paintings attributed to Rembrandt were produced collaboratively in his studio. The masterwork was a product of a system, not a solitary vision. The shift towards the lone genius narrative happened for specific reasons. It elevated the social status of artists. It gave wealthy patrons and collectors a more romantic story to invest in. And it created the conditions for the art market as we know it, where the name attached to an object matters more than almost anything else about it. Jean-Michel Basquiat is one of the great artists of the 20th century. His work is in the permanent collections of the world's most important museums and personal collections. In 2017, one of his paintings sold for over $100 million. That is a lot of money. The story told about Basquiat is almost always the genius story. The young Black man from Brooklyn who arrived on the New York art scene with spray paint and raw, convulsive vision. Outsider, a prodigy, tragic. And what that story often leaves out is Andy Warhol, who became Basquiat's collaborator and patron, and who used his enormous social capital to open doors that would otherwise have been closed to a young Black artist in a predominantly white art world. It leaves out the gallerists who exhibited him, the collectors who bought early work, the critics who wrote the language that made his work legible to the market. Basquiat's genius was real. But genius does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in relationship to support structures, to social networks, to the particular moment in time that is either receptive to what an artist is doing or is not. The reason this matters is not to diminish Basquiat or Picasso or any other individual talent. It is to make visible the conditions that allowed those talents to be seen. Because those conditions are uniquely distributed, and the genius myth makes that inequality invisible. In many African creative traditions, the lone genius was never the model. Collective making, where an object is a product by a community, where knowledge is transmitted through apprenticeship and inheritance, where the maker's identity is less important than the lineage the work belongs to. This has been dominant or the dominant model across much of the continent. Kente cloth from Ghana is woven according to patterns that carry the history of the Ashanti kingdom. The weaver is skilled, but the weaver is also a custodian, a link in a chain that stretches back centuries. The authorship is collective and temporal as much as it is individual. The Zimbabwean stone sculpture movement, previously known as the Shona stone sculpture movement, brought international attention to Zimbabwean art in the second half of the 20th century. It is interesting precisely because it sits at the intersection of individual vision and collective tradition. Artists like Henry Munyaradzi and Sylvester Mubai developed unmistakably individual styles, but they also emerged from a specific cultural and philosophical tradition: Shona cosmology, Shona relationships with the land, spirituality, and with stone. That shaped what they made. Their genius was real, but it was never entirely solitary. The genius myth does one more thing that I think is worth naming. It discourages ordinary people from being creative. When we are told that great art comes from a special category of person who's only born with it, or is touched by something divine, or is operating beyond the reach of normal human effort, we absorb the lesson that people without special quality just should not try. That making art without genius is a kind of presumption. This is both historically inaccurate and personally damaging. Creativity is a practice. It is built through attention, through repetition, through the willingness to make things badly until you make them better. Every artist we now call a genius had years of unglamorous work before the work that gets remembered. The story of this lone genius was always partly a marketing tool. The more honest story, messier and more social and more human, is also more useful because it belongs to all of us.